Hi, this is Paul. Every week when I do my rough draft for Sunday, I usually warn you that it's a rough draft. And some weeks are rougher than others. And there can be a lot of movement in the sermon between Friday and Sunday. And this week was quite true. If you're curious about how the sermon finally ended up, it was quite a bit more political, actually, including some of the stuff on Epiphany in the Capitol and some. I went back and looked at Rod Dreer's Jericho Road, that rally with the Pillow Man, the post on Rod Dreer. And it culminated Sunday morning because I usually get up Sunday morning and, rework the sermon so that it's ready for Sunday, 11 o'clock when I finally preach it. And I came up with something that I tweeted out. Nationalism has long been the methadone of true religion. What do I mean by that? Well, if you know what a methadone clinic is, if you go look at some of the stories, remember I grew up in Paterson, and one of the ministries of my father's church was a methadone clinic for recovering heroin addicts. Not a methadone clinic, I'm sorry. It was a recovery program. It was something more similar to a 12-step recovery program. It wasn't a methadone addict clinic. But a methadone clinic was basically a heroin replacement. You would go to the methadone clinic and they would give you a little pill, and that would satisfy your desire for heroin. And then you could keep your day job and you could manage your life quite a bit better. You wouldn't have to, the state would provide the methadone. You wouldn't have to break into people's houses to steal their TVs in order to sell it to get your fix. And that was going on a lot in Paterson at the time, which is why my father's church and other churches worked together to establish programs that helped people get off heroin and try to get into a normal life. And, part of the reason that I mentioned that was I'd had a little Twitter spat with I don't know how to describe her. Every now and then I sort of poke the bear. And so I kind of picked a fight with this woman on Twitter that was blaming Christianity for all the usual ills of our society. And I kind of said, well, if you say that Christianity was used for this, you ought to include flags and dogs and language and some of these things, because these things are all also used for white supremacy and patriarchy and all of these things. And then she quite unwisely challenged me that dogs were used for white supremacy. So it was pretty easy to produce a photo from the 1960s that demonstrated dogs being used to attack rallies of Martin Luther King Jr. And I made a little comment about how I'm a little older than you are, and so I remember some of these things. And then she basically said if I posted another tweet at her again, that she would block me, and I was triggered. So the all caps kind of made me wonder if she was triggered, but I settled down at that point and she continued the conversation. But that prompted me to think about the events that happened in Washington, D.C. on January 6th and think about nationalism's relationship with religion. And that's why I said, nationalism has long been the methadone of true religion. It's your love of America can replace your love of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying these things are mutually exclusive. Christians should love their country. Christians should be loyal and patriotic to their country. I've got enough nationalism in me. Also, some of it well-earned, having lived in a place like the Dominican Republic, where you can't live in some of these countries for too long and not deeply appreciate so much of what the United States is and has to offer. This is a very special nation in many ways, and it certainly has its flaws. It has its historical flaws. It has its contemporary flaws. It certainly has done evil many times and in many places against many people, some of whom its citizens, others in other nations. America is by no means perfect, and I'm not one who believes that America is the answer to the world's problems. I think when I hear politicians use that sort of rhetoric, I think they reach too high. I think they're now then into religious registers. I'm a Christian minister, so I much more believe in Jesus than I believe in America. But nationalism is for many people sort of a religion, and it works that way. Now, after I made my tweet, philosopher king Bob Breton. Now, I had a conversation with Bob Breton fairly early on. He grew up in the Christian Reformed Church as the son of a Christian Reformed minister, and is in some ways Mr. Non-Duality. And so, just like I sort of poked at that woman who was making those noises on Twitter, he likes to poke at me on Twitter, which is absolutely fine with me. I'm happy to engage with Bob. And so after I made my tweet, Bob asked, "Is religion the methadone of true spirituality?" Ooh, what is the relationship between religion and spirituality? I'm spiritual, but not religion. And these are, so then I answered him. I said, I won't answer that unless you can define both of these terms to my satisfaction, which is, of course, totally trollish move on my part, basically saying, I'm not going to answer until you satisfy me. But as anyone who demands a proof knows, it's sort of a trick that you make relationally, because you just withhold agreement and you hold the conversation hostage. So a little game that I'm playing. And then he responds, and I thought it was quite a good tweet. He said, "Spirituality, the recognition of the unity of everything via consciousness, and religion, the tribal structures which substitute conversion from one group to another for unconditional love." I thought those aren't bad answers. They don't satisfy me, but they're not bad answers. And religion and spirituality or spirit are enormously difficult things to define. So I thought, good job, Bob. That was a good attempt, and maybe my attempt is better. Maybe my attempt is worse. You can see that in the eye of the beholder, because I'm going to take that on in this video a little bit. Now, nothing I do here is going to be definitive, just because it's me. Nationalism is sort of a, nationalism as a religion or as an ideology. And I do like Jordan Peterson's definition that ideologies are crippled religions. It's sort of a nice way to phrase them, because religions have been around a very long time. And I should probably play James Lindsay's comments on the Safe Space Christmas party, because I referred to them in a previous video as well, and I thought they were very interesting comments that he made. I thought very perceptive. Definition of religion is very difficult, because there are multiple competing definitions, and that, I think, sort of displays the limitations of language in some ways, or at least the limitations of our capacity to wield language. In my videos alone, I've had Religion S, which is sort of a secular perspective on religion, and Religion W, which is sort of the worldview definition of religion. The secular definition is usually things that involve God or spiritual things or things like that, and that's a function, obviously, of the worldview. So Religion W is much larger than Religion S. But then we have to ask the question, what are we talking about when we say spirit or spiritual or spirituality? And again, these are very difficult things to talk about, and on my channel I've spoken about them quite a bit. I've been paging through Jonathan Pageau's brother's book, The Language of Creation, Cosmic Symbolism in Genesis, a commentary by, I will probably butcher your name, so I'll apologize in advance, because I don't speak French. And I know I butcher Pageau, or I don't want to say Pageau, which is the French auto company, Pageau. Mathieu, just listening to Jonathan say his name, Mathieu Pageau. And of course, you'll clean it up in the comments section for me. I actually bought the book twice. I bought it both in Kindle and in the physical copy. The physical copy that someone recommended, said first bought the Kindle copy, said, no, you should buy the physical copy, because it's really a nice, it's a lovely book. And I remember Alistair Roberts making the comments about the book, how much he appreciated it. And Alistair Roberts is, better educated theologically than I am. I mean, he's got excellent credentials, and Alistair Roberts is a very, very sharp guy. And, he spoke favorably of the book. And so I started paging through it, and right away in the introduction, stuff was hitting my, stuff hit my consciousness Congress, and they already started discussing sort of like the British Parliament. this book is not like any other biblical commentary. Why am I way back here and not up there like I have been lately? And I had a Sunday I sat down with Rick, and Rick said, I don't know if I like what you're doing lately, and so you need to hide the microphone better. And Rick is the maker of many improvements in my video land, always spurring me on. So, and those of you on the Discord server know who Rick is, and the ongoing conversation as to whether or not Rick is real or Rick is a part of my consciousness Congress. Those of you in the Sacramento meetup know Rick is very real. But so I'm using the sometimes you ask, this is a Sigma 16 millimeter E-mount lens on my Sony A6400. And Rick said, well, I kind of like seeing the titles of your books back here. And well, the Genesis commentaries are right up there at the upper left-hand corner of the commentary section of my books here in my office. And again, this is not like any other commentary I have on the book of Genesis. And that sort of is fitting for the fact that over the last 3 years, that my approach to working on the Bible has been shaped by Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau, and therefore by Mathieu Pageau as well. Again, I'm sorry, Matthew, that's the Englishized version of it, obviously. So I wanted to take a look at just the first 2 pages of the book. And I'm going to focus not so much on the content of the book, but the word choices. One of the word choices, the content of the book. I mean, these things are inescapable. And it's not a criticism of the language. I'm dealing with what John Vervaeke always points out. We're kind of stuck with the language we've got. And John, for that reason, is making a new one for us, which is, and both Jonathan Pageau and myself and many others who've been following his work, Mary Cohen, who we've had a couple of conversations with, Karen Wong. Mary Cohen and Karen Wong and Sevilla King, those 3 women are doing outstanding work. And they both, all 3 of them have ridiculously low subscriber numbers. It's kind of a YouTube culture to complain about a favorite channel that you don't think has enough subs. But Mary just recently did a conversation with Sevilla. Sevilla's been on my channel. And just this morning, I listened to Mary's conversation with Karen Wong. And, talk about 2 women with very accomplished, both of them in their lives on just about every level. They're mothers. They've got experience with children. They've got experience in the workplace. They've got experience. Karen Wong is an artist. Mary Cohen is a homeschooling grandma. Both of them with significant political experience and significant religious experience. And, what those 2 are doing on their channels is just inspiring. And so they are, if you're looking for some women to follow in this corner of the internet, they are so brimming with wisdom and winsomeness and intelligence. They're all such remarkable people. Anyway, hey, I did the randos video this morning, and after I had that in the can yesterday, and then I thought, gosh, I should have talked about Sevilla and Mary and Karen. Anyway, back to the point of this page. The introduction reads like this. Introduction. As our technological knowledge distances us from nature, right there, bang, Consciousness Congress hit and said, nature? What does he mean by nature? And in many ways, Mary Cohen has been making this point throughout her channel, where she talks about the stuff in the soil and raising her chickens and raising children. This is the natural world. Again, back to C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, physis, natura, physis in Greek, natura in Latin, things that go on their own. And just this morning, someone from the Discord server sent me the introduction to panpsychism that came up in the Vervaeke talk. And I think as I'm learning this stuff, I have a better understanding why J.P. Marceau has been excited about panpsychism. And so it's getting interesting in terms of how we're turning over these leaves and finding things. But as our technical knowledge distances us from nature, which is really interesting because what our technical knowledge is all about is colonizing nature. And so right away you have the definition of what exactly are we talking about when we use this word nature. We'll come around back to this in a few minutes. We find it increasingly difficult to reconcile the current scientific worldview to the biblical worldview. And again, what Matthew, I'm just calling him Matthew because I'm speaking English. What Matthew is dealing with is that we're having to use these words more like labels than descriptions. And I know I don't know what other words he would use without horrendous footnotes. And these are the words that we're currently using to try to understand and talk to one another. But the further I go into this, the increasingly insufficient they appear to me. A scientific cosmology. We might say better a post scientific revolution cosmology, or a university, a secular university cosmology, or a cosmology of certain corners of the academy, because it is just as much a story as a traditional cosmology. And this gets into, what Jonathan has pushed often, and he's right about this. I mean, what is the difference between a flat Earth and a round Earth? Well, it's a point of view, a perspective. If you're standing in the Central Valley of California, the Earth is flat, and if the day's really clear, you can see the mountains in the distance. And one who hasn't traveled much would be forgiven for saying, well, the sky seems to be held up by the mountains. I've told the story a number of times when I was doing a series of sermons in all of the Haitian churches in my district in the Dominican Republic. And because many of the people only spoke Creole, I took a translator with me. I preached in Spanish, and my translator translated it to Creole. And he was one of the best educated members of the local churches that I could find. He was, in fact, the school teacher in the local Christian school. And we're driving down the coastal highway in a beautiful area of the Dominican Republic. And he asks me one day, he says, just sort of whimsically, I wonder what it's like where the sky meets the sea. It wasn't speaking poetically. He believed in a flat earth, and he lived on an island. And then another day that we're traveling, he asked me if I was going to drive to New York. And I wanted to. You can't drive to New York from Hispaniola. You live on an island. But this wasn't much different from when I was a day camp counselor in Patterson. Yeah, I know you've got your bingo there. Patterson, Dominican Republic. Fill out your little bingo. And. Patterson, when I was teaching in day camp, kids who were growing up in Patterson who had never been more than 3 or 4 blocks from their house. They walked to school. They walked home. They walked to the corner store. Every now and then, one of them had taken a trip back down south to their relatives that still lived in the Carolinas, and they had a whole bigger world. So these labels, we have to use them. We know what they mean. They're adequate labels in some ways, but they're inadequate descriptions. So I discussed the differences between the scientific and traditional cosmologies, as well as the importance in rediscovering the ancient biblical worldview. A worldview that to one degree or another is shared, and we've sort of personified the Bible in a way that again, this stuff, the deeper you look into it, the more complex it gets. Is there only one worldview in the Bible? There are 2 testaments, and there are significant differences between them. But, Jonathan, or or Matthew is quite right in that there's far more commonality between them, between the Apostle Paul and the Old Covenant, than there is between either of those and our own world. So in many ways, what he's doing in this book is sort of what I've been doing on my channel all along, coming at it from a different perspective. This is followed by a brief commentary on the first day of creation with a focus on the cosmic duality called heaven and earth. The practical implications of this duality are then examined in the stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and Noah. All right, so that's the introduction to the commentary. And then you go into chapter 1, and right at the top we have spiritual and material perspectives. And again, we're dealing more with labels than description, because does material have perspective? Sort of, because material can be located in time and space. But the spiritual, and then in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Unlike modern science, traditional cosmology did not attempt to describe reality in terms of atoms, energy, and mechanical causality. Okay. Instead, most ancient cultures perceived the world in terms of spiritual principles such as angels, demons, and mysterious sea monsters at the edge of the world. Now, so before attempting to interpret a book like Genesis, it's important to understand why our current worldview is so different from that of the past. And I don't know that he explains why the worldview is different. I think that's more knocking on the door of Charles Taylor and many conversations we've had in terms of all the way back to Athens and Jerusalem, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, into the Middle Ages. I mean, to answer that question, why our current worldview is so different, is fundamentally a historical question, not necessarily an interpretive question. But again, I mean, I'm not picking on this book. This is the only language we have. And even putting angels, demons, and sea monsters together, well, he's starting then to get into where he's going to go with it. And again, I'm a fan here, but the next little diagram he has of spiritual perspective, again, it's not a bad label, but as a pastor, what this invokes is so much evangelical speak. And of course, Jonathan and his brother grew up in an evangelical household and then went over to orthodoxy. And this is all very much post-modernist fundamentalist split. And what's interesting is that even the most ardent modernists inside and outside the church, and especially those who have, let's say, left behind organized religion and become spiritual, wouldn't really complain about the labels. But what on earth they mean by them, and again, I've said this many times in my years behind this microphone. Someone comes to my adult Sunday school class and they point out this as a spiritual instead of an earthly interpretation. And again, that's that's the duality of heaven and earth. That's what we're dealing with. So then I'll just, if I think that we have the time and the opportunity to have a productive conversation, I'll then challenge them. What do you mean by that word spiritual? And sometimes there's a flash of panic on people's eyes because I've just sort of exposed them to the fact that they've used a word that they've got a rather sloshy definition of. And what's more, the word gets used in a very fudgy way to sort of reinforce, and this gets back to Bob Brenton's definition of religions, to reinforce tribal bounds. So is this orthodoxy that Matthew is talking about here? I don't know if Matthew goes to an Orthodox church or no. I know Jonathan does. But we're not escaping these issues by going to Mass instead of going to church. We're not escaping these issues by figuring out what to do with icons as opposed to rejecting them. What is a spiritual perspective? What is a material perspective? And he defines them below a bit. Spiritual perspective, what does it mean? Okay, I think that's helpful. What truth does it embody? Boy, embodiment is a material world. And word again, I don't think I'm even disagreeing with the point that he's making with the illustration. As a preacher, I pay a lot of attention to language because language is a primary tool that I have that I use in order to help people with the formation of Christ in them and point people towards Christ. That's what a minister's job is. And so a great degree of a minister's job is translation. And so it's really a translation issue that I'm sort of poking at this book. Material perspective, again, I don't know that we have struggled to use a better label, because if you're writing a book, you want to use the label that the broadest possible audience might understand. But again, he might better say heavenly perspective and earthly perspective, but that's not without its huge issues as well. And again, those of you that think I'm picking on Jonathan's brother, I'm not. In some ways, I don't know if he struggled with this, and I wouldn't have struggled with this as much 5 or 10 years ago as I do now, but I can't read these words now and not struggle. Material perspective, how does it work? What material is it made of? And this is where angels and demons, as opposed to sea monsters, get very interesting, because I haven't really gotten to the place where I can make a video about it, but many of you who've been listening to my videos a lot know that I'm wrestling with Cartesian duality, because I think in terms of the pictures in our minds, again, read C.S. Lewis's chapter in Miracles on horrid red things. Don't just read that chapter once, read it 4 or 5 times. I've read that chapter at least a dozen times now, and I'm still trying to get my mind around it. Pictures come to mind of, well, we have a lot of experience with matter, okay? But then we imagine, well, what are angels made of? Do angels have substances? And this gets into some of what Mary and Karen talked about, because Karen, as she was developing her skills as an artist and taking an art class, had to make 20 portraits of the same thing in the same place on the canvas. And that forced her to look at the elements of design. And if you don't know what those are, look at Karen's channel and look at that conversation between Karen and Mary. And it gets into this because it gets into the question of substances. And so you have to ask, what is the substance of spiritual reality? And see, even, now I'm going to have to complain about my own language there, and that's the best I could do, at least in the moment. Because if you look at the video I played before about substances, what is a substance? A substance is the thing beneath some of the externals can change, I'll say it that way, but the thing underneath can't. So this is where we get into Vervaeke issues about essence. The reality and the relationship, and Strawn is going to be all over this. And Strawn was the guy who first put me on to Vervaeke. He's someone who watched my videos, watched Jordan Peterson videos, started emailing me these large emails with large sections out of philosophical Wikipedia entries and And one of the big issues for Strawn is the question of essence or substance. And then I know some of you who have been following the orthodoxy conversations are going to say, well, we shouldn't really talk about substances. We should talk about energies. That's, quite frankly, a significant improvement because, and I don't know if to the degree that it's an improvement philosophically, because I'm not a philosopher, but I think it's an improvement homiletically. Because at least I think in our contemporary linguistic imaginary, now I know I'm getting terribly esoteric with this stuff, energies are a little bit better than essences or substances. Because once essence not as bad, but once we talk substance, I think we are so deeply penetrated by our materialistic culture. And see, I just used the same words Matthew used. We're fighting with labels here. We're trying to find better ones. But in our current culture, I think it's nearly impossible for us to talk about substances without talking about matter. I don't know that we're capable of that right now. And so energies sort of at least dematerializes it for us to a degree that E equals mc squared has penetrated our consciousness to one degree or another. And that's why when you put angels, demons, and sea monsters, because if I would say sea monster, you very much will think materially, whether or not you should. But you wouldn't think materially with respect to angels and demons, and for that reason, there's going to be deep skepticism about their ontology. And this gets into the entire question of the existence of God. And this is why in my conversation with Nathan, when I sort of challenged him on God exists and Jesus exists, are in a deep way two different sentences. Now, I'm not saying that one is right and one is wrong. I believe they both are right. But the existence of God, and I'm a Trinitarian Christian. Jesus is God. Okay, Nicaea, John 1. But the existence of Jesus and what we're saying there in that little two-word sentence is different from God exists. Well, then the question is, okay, what do we mean when we're using that word God? And again, I'm not casting doubt on the divinity of Christ. But, some of these same tensions I feel when, again, read Plato's Republic and watch them talk about the gods and watch them talk about the God. Why would you use both categories? And when they're saying the God, they don't mean Zeus, because Zeus is one of the gods. When they're talking about the God, they're talking much more a Hebrew conception of it. Now, I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not a historian, I'm not a classicist. I mean, part of the liability about being a pastor is that I know just enough of this stuff to be dangerous and to be dangerously wrong. But pastors in some ways are right there at the juncture between heaven and earth, because we sort of have to translate one to the other. And Christian pastors are prophet, priests, and kings, the three offices of Christ. We try to embody them all in one way or another. We put on different hats at different times. And so spiritual perspective, what does it mean? And we got to talk about what does it means. And again, this gets so terribly esoteric, it sort of floats away. What truth does it embody? And this is where I think we're getting at 1 Corinthians 15, and when the Apostle Paul talks about spiritual bodies. And again, when modern readers read that, they think immaterial because they define spiritual as immaterial, which isn't wrong, even though I believe the Apostle Paul is making the point that our bodies will be like Jesus' body and that they will be physical and material. But when Paul uses the word spiritual in that, he's using it much more in terms of a functional relation. And this is where I want to flip to another book. John Walton, who taught Old Testament at Wheaton for a long time, and has his Lost World series, where in a lot of ways I think he tries to address these issues, and he comes at them from the perspective of a biblical scholar. Proposition 2 in his book, he has a series of propositions. Ancient cosmology, we're talking about the same thing that Matthew is. Ancient cosmology is function-oriented. And he begins the chapter with a sentence. What does it mean for something to exist? And I think Walton is dead on right here. Because again, in terms of our contemporary imaginary, existence is so deeply tied to materiality that the existence of Santa Claus, or the existence of Uncle Sam, or the existence of the United States government, right away that it's kind of easy to throw that up and say, does that exist? Does the United States government exist? Why was it so important that this rally stormed the Capitol? If they had stormed a sports arena, well, people would have been upset. And if security guards had been killed, people would have been upset. But all the language about insurrection and coup would not be used. It would have been trespassing, because the United States government is a very real entity, but it is not material. And so Walton really starts out quite nice. I'll just read this first page of this one. What does it mean for something to exist? It might seem like an odd question with perhaps an obvious answer, but it is not as simple as it may seem. For example, when we say that a chair exists, now we're we're talking Jordan Peterson stuff again. That a chair exists, we are expressing a conclusion on the basis of an assumption that certain properties of the chair define it as existing. So we've got properties and substances now, okay? Now we're back into that language. Without getting bogged down in philosophy, in our contemporary way of thinking, a chair exists because it is material. We can detect it with our senses, particularly sight and touch. We can analyze what it is made of. These physical, and I think this is where we should be using the word physical more often than a lot of these other words that we're using, because it's more precise. These physical qualities are what make the chair real, and because of them, we consider it to exist. But there are other ways to think about the question of existence. For example, we might consider what it means when we talk about a company existing. It would certainly not be the same as a chair existing. Does a company exist when it has filed the appropriate papers of incorporation? Does it exist when it has a building or a website? In some sense, the answer to these would have to be yes, but many would prefer to speak of a company as existing when it is doing business. Consider what is communicated when a small retail business frames and displays the first dollar bill from the first sale. That's in a sense that's an artifact of the immaterial company. That is a material production that shows the reality of the company, even though the company itself is immaterial. It's relational in many ways. As another alternative, consider a restaurant that is required to display its current permit from the City Department of Health. Without that permit, the restaurant could be said to not exist, or now during a COVID thing, for it cannot do any business. Here, existence is connected to the authority that governs existence in relation to the function the business serves. It is the government permit that causes that restaurant to exist. And say, not exactly. And its existence is defined in functional terms. That's better, because the government doesn't actually create. And I know why Walton uses that description there. The government doesn't actually create the restaurant. What creates the restaurant? The functional, this is where Vervaeke. This is a functional thing that is happening here. And the fancy Vervaeke words escape me. A little bit more from that chapter. In this book, I propose that people in the ancient world believed that something existed not by virtue of its material properties, ties, but by virtue of properties. No, that's a problem in the cutting and pasting of Kindle. Not by virtue of its material properties, but by virtue of its having a function in an ordered system. Here I do not refer to an ordered system in scientific terms. And if I kvetch about Matthew, I have to kvetch about John. Again, these are the labels that we have. But in an ordered system in human terms, that is, in relation to society and culture. In this sort of functional ontology, the sun does not exist by virtue of its material properties or even by its function as a burning ball of gas. Rather, it exists by virtue of the role that it has in its sphere of existence, particularly in the way that it functions for humankind and human society. In theory, this way of thinking could result in something being included in the existent category in a material way, but still considered in the non-existent category in functional terms. Okay? See the illustration of the restaurant mentioned above. In a functional ontology, it brings something into existence. To bring something into existence would require giving it a functional or a role in an ordered system, rather than giving it material properties. Consequently, something could be manufactured physically, but still not exist if it has not become functional. All right. Now, I could have a lot of... Some people are made very uncomfortable by this move. And I understand why they're made uncomfortable by this move. And I share some of that, and another part of it I don't share. And you might be surprised by which part makes me uncomfortable and which part doesn't. Because this gets into the question of... See, I think what Walton is doing in his Lost World books is trying to introduce an academic perspective into the church conversation. And why a lot of people feel uncomfortable with this is because in some ways it sort of feels like the modernist fundamentalist fight. And maybe they have a point in some of this. But I'm thinking that the paradigm is shifting sufficiently that elements that the modernist fundamentalists share are both going away, and we're going to be thinking in different terms that a lot of the technological changes of the last 30, 40 years are affording in terms of our imaginary. You can't watch, let's say, The Good Place or Upload on Amazon, these shows that are trying to wrestle with life of the age to come, wrestle with authorship, without noticing the shift from a deistic materialist worldview. Again, I'm not really complaining about Matthew because these are the labels that we have, and they're incredibly hard to get around, to a virtual worldview, a worldview in which Josh Topolsky, again, a tech blogger, is convinced by Elon Musk that we're living in a simulation, to the degree that when the Capitol gets stormed, Josh Topolsky says the simulation is coming to an end. I don't think this is theologically different from New Testament authors talking about us being at the end of the age. But what has shifted is that our new involvement in different technologies, along with the new affordances of of science, much of which I think has really helped to contribute to the meaning crisis, gives us different imaginary tools which reshape our language and our conviction about the nature of reality. And I think that's part of the reason. That's part of the reason we're seeing a new excitement about sacramental theology and sacramental liturgy and sacramental ecclesiology in the church. And I think this is part of the reason Jordan Peterson was bread pilling people. And in one of Rationality Rules video, I thought he hit it dead on. I mean, he's been looking very closely at Jordan Peterson, and he said, Jordan Peterson does not cross the line, but basically builds the steps over, I'm adding a little bit to his metaphor, builds the step over the wall and everyone else just sort of walks through. And I think that's exactly right. Because Jordan Peterson knows where the line is, and he keeps emphasizing that he knows where the line is by all of the little disclaimers he makes when he does his thing in the biblical series. I'm talking as a scientist. I'm speaking psychologically. And when he says I'm speaking psychologically, he's speaking from science. And he's saying this only takes us so far, and he prefers to be what I call an open agnostic, at least publicly, on the other side. Now, where he is personally is another question. But again, what he's doing there is playing, basically, is observing the modernist boundaries. But what's happening in our culture as virtual reality glasses become more and more powerful and augmented reality becomes more and more powerful, and more of our life is lived looking into screens and listening from cell phones and computers and TVs, that it is affording new metaphors which are shifting materiality out from under us. When the shift, the economic shift goes from General Electric and General Motors and Procter and Gamble to Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, the shift is underway. And so this functional ontology, as John Walton calls it, I think maps very clearly onto Matthew Pageau's spiritual, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the thing that moves the world. Or, see, I used thing, and that's still too much in the old paradigm. We're talking about spirit. So Verizon Lisa talks to the universe. That's a very vague, sloppy, sort of primitive, sort of a toddler, a religious toddler babbling when we talk to the universe, after we deconstruct from more vigorous worldviews. And I've used the illustration again, school spirit, because it's something we can all relate to, how school spirit moves. Nationalism, the spirit of America, is in play and under siege, or thriving, or again, it is a good thing that this stuff hasn't departed from our language, that language changes so slowly that we wake up and discover that these things are still available to us. That's a good thing. And so that's the upside of the Vervaekian frustration with language, that we have to figure out new language. Yeah, but it's a good thing a lot of the old language is still here too, because that can be brought back. And that can be looked at. We can pull it out of the basement or pull it out of the attic, depending on which side of the United States you live on. We don't have basements here in California. So school spirit moves the school. And with the illustration of school spirit, you can see quite easily how we are spiritual creatures. And we are spiritual creatures by not only our capacity to mold and move material. Material contributes to school spirit. Architecture contributes to school spirit. But again, once I highlight architecture, you notice that it's not so much the chemistry in the brick, it's how the brick is changed by a spiritual agent called an architect. And architects, especially by virtue of the artistry that they are employing and the history and all of that, at the Connecticut retreat that we had an architect and his son there, and I was deeply grateful for their contributions at that retreat, because he brought out a whole new way, and he was immediately captivated by Pageau's work, because he saw right away, this is my job. It's architecture. It's not simply functional. It's always more than that, and construction that attempts to be merely functional makes a spiritual statement. Spirit is whatever, well, we have it in language again, whoever the Spirit moves, or however the Spirit moves, or whomever the Spirit moves, or however the Spirit moves me. I mean, that's the absolute perfect use of the word. Ideologies are spiritual. Nationalism is spiritual. All of these things are spiritual. Well, what do I mean by that? These are unseen movers of materiality. The architect is spiritual. And you might say, well, maybe he's an atheist architect. He's still spiritual because he is imbuing a building with spirit. I'm hard-pressed to have a better illustration than Jesus' own, which was built into the language which Barfield plucks out and says, look, spirit and wind. The wind blows where it wills. You don't know where it comes from. You don't know where it goes. You can't see it. You can only see the matter that is moved by it. But it is real. It is functional. It is more real than the stuff it is blowing by virtue of the fact that it's colonizing it and moving it. Now, you might say, yeah, but the mountain is real and it's stopping the wind. Yeah, that's true too. But the mountain has been pushed by other spirits, and now we're getting into elemental language, and on and on and on it goes. And very quickly you're saying, we're talking like people thousands of years ago. Yes, we are. Which is exactly Pageau's point, and very much Walton's point. And what this means is we're leaving modernity. The train has left the station, and, well, it's not going to be, this gets into the question and answer last Friday. Is Jonathan Pageau postmodern? Yeah. Someone said he's postmodern. Yeah. Is he ancient? Yeah. But you can never really be ancient again. At least not if you're going to use electricity and cars and YouTube and email. The Amish know this. So that's what spirit is. It's the unseen mover, shaper, molder of the world. And there are many of them. We are spiritual. And again, with sort of a Cartesian dualism about that, then you put people on scales before they die to see, do they get any lighter? Can you weigh the soul? No, it's spiritual. Well, what do you mean by that? It's the thing that moves you. Well, and again, I'm triggering some dualisms in all of you. And, Bob is probably pretty excited by now. But your birth was a spiritual event, and parents in the delivery room know this. That's why they cry. History is spiritual. Earth movers are spiritual because something is moving the earth. It might be the engineer, it might be the driver, Probably both. But it's spiritual. Well, what is spiritual about it? Well, the story is moving the earth because someone has a desire for a building to embody a corporation. Now, I was listening again to Karen and Mary's conversation and thinking about the fact that the definitions here. So nature is what goes on its own. And now panpsychism says, well, see, panpsychism is just trying to address the problem from the other way around, because materiality, if spirit is only moved by materiality, that just then reason doesn't exist. And then all there is nature. And then you're stuck sort of in the beginning of Lewis, and now a structural, functional, self-organizing. All right, but then we've got again the emanation versus the emergent. So we're back into that conversation with Pageau and Vervaeke. You see, reason goes on its own, and Lewis makes the case that, or nature goes on its own, that reason is what disrupts the natural flow of things. The natural dog has fleas. The dog which is owned gets washed. Washing a dog with soap and water or giving the dog preventative flea medication is not natural. And it's embodied in our language. The natural dog has fleas. The natural teeth have not been added by the dentist. They grow on their own. That's how our language works. Reason is purposive in a way nature in modernity is not. And again, a big part of this question is there purpose behind nature? And of course, Lewis will go here because, yes, there is, and reason continues to, there's a purpose behind it. That the creator God is the redeemer God in Christianity. They're not two gods. Now, there's a deep irony with all of this rationalist debunking because they destroy reason in the name of reason. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if it's all just the playing out of nature, then reason doesn't exist, because reason is the thing that interrupts nature. Now, Lewis would say reason can perfect nature, and I think Lewis is right. Reason, and Lewis will use the illustration that the land receives its king, and nature is such a thing that it is so easily colonized by reason that you would imagine that reason is not alien to it. Reason is, well, nature is the product of reason, capital R, which is why it's so orderly, which is why we so easily say laws of nature without a hint of embarrassment. Rationalist atheism, as opposed to nihilism, reserves human privilege. But on what grounds? And again, this is what Lewis continues to point out. And I think part of the meaning crisis is, can it remain? Or is that movement simply self-destructive? If left on its own, if reason doesn't prevail, it destroys itself and just goes back into nature without any reason or technology at all. That's what death is. And again, Mary and Karen had an interesting section about entropy in life and death. Is the ball resting on the top of the hill? What's its relationship to entropy? Well, it's at rest, but there's potential with a little nudge that it rolls down the hill, losing its entropy. Life is in some ways anti-entropy. This stuff gets really complicated. So then what is religion? Religion is in some ways spirit plus reason. Searching for logos, and just think about logos and reason. Searching for logos amid spirit. Jesus stands up and stills the wind. Now think about that symbolically. And think about the first chapter of the Gospel of John. Religion is looking for a way to participate in logos and even create logos and define logos. Looking to wield nature. And when you look at, well, the Greeks didn't know they had a religion. The Mayas didn't know they had a religion. Well, they're all attempting to wield nature. That's what religion is. Someone would say, well, isn't that what technology is? Yes. Technology is deeply religious. And in some ways, they're united. But religion looks to wield the technology wielder. So in the chain, religion is above technology. And religion is above nationalism, because nationalism is, of course, down the chain from religion. And it's sort of methadone. It's the thing you can have to help you keep your day job. People have an ability to look up the chain, but often don't. And when they don't, they become animal. What do I mean by that? Do animals use reason? They seem to have the building blocks of a degree of reason in one way or another. They're not unreasonable. If I knock something off the table, the dog will move away so it doesn't land on him, and then he'll move forward to see if he can get a snack. It's not unreasonable at all. But it's not the level of rationality that we see in us. Well, and Lewis would argue, so there's this chain of being, in a sense, and reason can help you climb it. But nationalism is down it. Technology is down it. Because, well, what is religion? Religion moves people, which is why it's spiritual. But it moves people with reason. But yeah. So, yeah. Hard stuff, good stuff, fun stuff. Oh, yeah, the end. Cognition alone is insufficient. And this is lest we just float off into space. Knowing is merely a cognitive exercise is always insufficient. And this is where we're Christian and not Gnostic. Knowing in a biblical sense is always physical. Adam knew Eve. Yada. Adam knew Eve. It wasn't merely cognitive. It's consummation. It is union of heaven and earth. It is the loving of heaven towards earth. It is the marriage of the Son of God and the church. It is consummation. And that's how the language works. So, yeah, I hope this was helpful. We'll see if I keep talking about Matthew Pageau's book. It's a very interesting book. But we'll see if it triggers my consciousness Congress some more.